So my name is Nicola Taylor, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Scotland Is. For those of you who don't know who Scotland Is are, we are a membership organisation who act as the trade body for the digital tech sector here in Scotland. Today's session, we'll dive into one of the most transformative technologies of our time, artificial intelligence, and discuss how it's reshaping business landscapes, presenting immense opportunities, and bringing challenges we're only beginning to understand. AI is everywhere. Whether we lovingly embrace it or approach it with a healthy dose of trepidation, one thing is clear: we cannot ignore it. For senior leaders, it's no longer a question of if AI will impact our world, but how, and whether you're ready to meet the challenges and capitalise on the opportunities it presents. I am delighted to be joined today by a group of specialists in the field, starting with AI expert and digital technology thought leader, Brian Eldridge. Brian will guide us through the current state of AI and future trends, practical applications of AI in business, ethical and regulatory considerations, and strategies for integrating AI into your organisation. After Brian's presentation, we'll open the floor to your questions, which I would again ask you to drop into the chat box and I can facilitate them for you. During the Q&A, Brian will be joined by a panel of experts, including lawyer Rosemead Hart, focused on multi-platform legal and business affairs, a familiar face to many of our Scotland Is members, Richard Marshall from Concept Gap, and Alex Klein of Jump Digital. We'll conclude the session with some closing remarks from Richard, and perhaps, if you're lucky, a small teaser of what you can expect to see at our Tech Trends events in January, which are almost at capacity. So if you haven't already signed up for those, I would encourage you to do that quickly. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Scotland Is member Jump Digital and their International Advisory Board for partnering with us today to make today's session possible. And if that's not enough, as part of our event, Jump Digital is offering a free course to everybody who has joined us today for their new digital sustainability e-learning, which is worth £150. We will contact you after this to discuss that with you in more detail, but if anybody is interested, you can obviously contact myself or Kat Blair. Anywho, nobody is here to listen to me waffle on. So without further ado, I shall pass you over to Brian. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Nicole. And actually, I do enjoy listening to you. So you could have gone on and that would have been fun.
You are far too
First
sweet.
of all, first of all, it is so great to see everyone here today. There's some familiar faces, some new faces out there. We've had a lot of fun the last couple of years doing these types of events. AI is something that's absolutely grabbed everyone's attention. It's transformative. In some ways, it's divisive in others. And today we want to unpack those topics that Nicole was talking about on the agenda and hopefully prime everyone for a very lively discussion afterward. So this is the agenda, just to recap the current state of AI, future trends, some practical applications, ethical regulatory considerations, and strategies with some practical tips of integrating AI into your organization. And this is really important because one of the things that we found, and we've been interviewing some of the top business leaders in the world, CIOs, CTOs, CEOs, and one of the biggest challenges that they've had is the initiation process. How do I get started with AI? How do I get my first project? How do I get this thing off the ground? But before we get started, I always like to do this exercise, is if you could put this in the chat, what is the first word that you think of when you hear AI? What is that first word that comes to mind? Any interesting responses, Nicole?
So the first response we have is patterns.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That may have been Richard.
Machine learning is another one that's popping up. Mine's is confusion.
Okay.
that's my ChatGPT is another one. Terminator we've got in there as well. So quite the edge AI. Another one that's popped up there. Scary or exciting. So probably 50-50 split with that.
Okay. Interesting. So why do you think that understanding AI is so important? I can tell you, I'll answer this question. It's something that's proliferating every part of our life, every part of our business. And I think that we're going to have two camps of people who really understand AI and can use AI to run their business, to introduce efficiencies, to maintain competitive advantage, and the people that put their head in the sand or have a hard time getting out of the starting gate, who could very likely be left behind. And why do you think that AI is potentially transformational to your organization? So that's something that I want you to keep front of mind as we move through the presentation. But getting back to some of the responses and the analysis of this, there is a lot of fear. We interviewed over 100 of the top global business leaders. Oops, there's my headset. And these were the primary responses. These were the number one responses that came back about their fear. They're overwhelmed. If you try to follow AI, you see every day there's a new large language model, there's a new technology that's coming out, there's some new advancement in robotics in some other area with a bunch of new acronyms that perhaps you don't understand that ties into the complexity. When you're already under a tremendous amount of pressure as a business leader to be able to demonstrate return on investment, how do you justify return on investment when you're already working with very tight margins? So why take the risk? So there's a risk of doing it. There's a risk of not doing it. There's no clear governance or mandates. There's been a lot of just go out there and make it happen. There's an incredible acceleration in the pace of change. And we're seeing a major appetite for risk aversion. There's a fear of missing out, but there's also a fear of getting in, and a general just fear of AI. So there's a big emotional component to this that I don't think that we can ignore. And all of these fears are exacerbated by the facts that as business leaders, you're getting more and more pressure to act now. Okay, so it's almost a time test and something that's really new and complex. So all of those things have combined together to have fear. And I know in dealing with a lot of uncertainty over the course of my career in a lot of different situations, the way that I best address fear and trepidation is to try to break it down, try to look at things in very logical ways that I can attack one step at a time, measure my success, learn from my mistakes, and progress. So we're going to look at some techniques today of how we can do that. So what's the current state? And just some housekeeping on the presentation. This presentation is going to have probably more text what you're used to seeing. And the reason for that is that after each of these, people really want to have copies of the presentation. And my instructor notes don't always suffice. So we're not going to read everything on every screen, but just so you guys know, we will also be providing a copy of this presentation for everyone afterwards. So you can share it, you can reuse it, anything you want to. But the current state is AI adoption is accelerating everywhere. Natural language processing, which is my background, in generative AI. This is the use of language. Before the previous generations of AI that were in wide use were based on numbers and data, right? We're being able to predict trends. We're being able to look at an image of a cell to tell whether it's malignant or not. We're able to make all kinds of decisions based on quantitative data. But now with the advances in compute power and what's available with Gen AI, we're able to look at things with much deeper insight in a manner that's more similar to the way that we think and discuss things. So about sentiment, nuance, and understanding, that is really changing the landscape. Even with basic tools like Claude and Chat GPT, we're able to do things with a pace and a scale that we simply couldn't do before these AI technologies hit the market. Ethical AI, explainability, and compliance. We found that in early days of AI, when businesses were starting to seriously consider it, the initial focus was on ethics. And it became so complex that people got bogged down and never got off the starting block. But we're also seeing now that ethics isn't just something that is so important for initiation. Organizations are realizing that if they want to scale their AI solutions, they really have to have their ethics nailed down, their explainability. I know that in most of Europe, if AI was used as criteria for your creditworthiness for a loan, for example, and you were turned down, there needs to be explainability of how that model works so you can understand that decision. We're also seeing this with large language models. People want to know what these models were trained on. right? That's quite important because that has ethical implications. It has authenticity and accuracy implications. It has regulatory implications. So this area is really evolving rapidly, and something that I expect that we're going to hear a lot in the coming months. The business leaders are now leveraging AI to be competitive, to maintain competitive edge, to differentiate themselves from competition. Automation is huge, and I think when some of us hear the term automation, we think about uh, manufacturing plants and those types of things, but it's much more than that. Like I develop a lot of PowerPoints, and I'm using AI to automate that process. And what used to take me 30, 35 hours, I can get done in an hour now. And so I think as we're looking at AI, I think we have to look broadly at the type of tasks that we perform, how AI can impact those tasks, introduce efficiencies, and introduce production values in ways that we couldn't do at scale before these tools were available. So what are some of the emerging trends? Again, we're just talking about this AI-driven automation. It's going to reshape workflows, but it's not only going to reshape those workflows and cost structures, but it's going to restructure our business models. One of the examples I use a lot is these big four firms used to throw 20 bodies at a project. They charge X thousand dollars a day, and and then they leave, and then the solution becomes less efficient, and then you have to call them back later and pay them even more money. But now that we have these AI tools and capabilities, how do those organizations make money? How do they generate revenue without creating new business models? And I think the people who can really adapt on the business model, there'll be people who can master the technology quite quickly, but you really have to be able to marry that buying and selling process and adopt your business models in a way where you can continue to generate in new ways, in ways maybe you haven't thought of before by the automation. And we're hearing this a lot from procurement departments when they're talking to external vendors. They want to know that you're using AI. Not because they think that you're cheating them somehow, but they want to make sure that you've introduced those efficiencies into your own process. Okay, they don't want someone that's going to go bill them for 35 hours for something they know that they can get done in an hour with AI. Real-time decision making, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's a big one. Continuous learning and adaptation. So models that are continually learning, they have streaming data coming in. We're also seeing this in some of the work with Jump Digital is when you build digital content, how can you use AI to continuously update that content with the goal of keeping it evergreen, as regulations change, as political landscapes change, as new products are introduced and new products are sunset. How can we use AI to continuously improve our digital assets and continuously improve the data vectors that we're using to run these large models on? And one of the big areas we're seeing this is in retail and consumer packaged goods is hyper personalization of products. That's something that is there's a lot of focus and a lot of money being spent on improving customer experience and increasing brand loyalty and engagement. That is, as all these brands are into the marketplace, there's a tremendous amount of competition. There's all kinds of supply chain issues. There's potential tariffs hanging out there. So in order to be competitive, organizations are looking to be able to get deeper digital insights to provide hyper personalization of their products. Any questions so far? Any comments?
No,
So what are
nothing
some
yet.
Okay. So what are some practical applications? Obviously, retailers are using this to automate inventory management, ensuring shelves are used, really being very precise. You're going to hear the word precision a lot, like we have precision agriculture, using technology, precision pharmacy, where we're being able to look at the human genome and other health factors to give the right medicine in the right amounts at the right time. And retailers are starting to introduce this level of precision with inventory management. Financial institutions, as you can imagine, were very early adopters of AI for things like anti-money laundering, but also for productive things like KYC, fraud detection. In early days of using Gen AI, they found that I think 80% of malware attacks in financial institutions, 80% of the code had been used in previous attacks. So whoever said patterns in the beginning was absolutely spot on. AI is absolutely fantastic at spotting patterns, and fraud is definitely something that is driven by patterns. E-commerce companies, again, personalization. Manufacturing, it's not just about supply chain disruptions, it's about things like predictive maintenance, right? You can use robotics and you can listen to sounds, you can look at patterns, and you can start predicting when things need to be replaced on an assembly line with a level of precision that you haven't been able to before. And with the integration of AI and robotics, it's not just that the robots talk to each other now, but the parts within a robot talk to each other with the standard communication protocol. So we're able to track those conversations and the data that traverses between the within and between parts of robotics to predict and with a level of precision we've just never been able to do before when we need to replace parts to keep production lines up and running. And then HR departments, and this is something I found really exciting because I'm kind of working on this right now, is having an organization that can put a job posting up, and we can use AI to create a set of interview questions, have the HR company embellish those questions, and then have someone drag and drop their CV in and use generative AI to create a bespoke interview for that person. So we can get very focused interview using AI and then take that data, automate it, organize it, send the top X candidates back to the job poster, and have them make much more informed and much more insightful decisions on AR and HR selections. So ethical and regulatory considerations, this is a big area. In the beginning, I was almost resentful how much focus there was on this because I wanted to get to the cool stuff. But the fact of the matter is, this is really important. And AI can do things that we don't do really well as humans. And I think that's kind of the use cases we need to look at. But looking at things like bias, being able to provide privacy at a level we haven't been able to. There's growing and growing compliance out there, and that's not going to change. You know, you're going to have to show that you're compliant with risk of major implications if you're not compliant. How do you operationalize abstract things like ethics with AI? And will there be industry and organizational standards of how to do that? And then there's transparency. You know, going back to the example of a large language model and what it was trained on, I think people are going to want to know, you know, where the data is coming from. They're wanting to, it's like going to the grocery store. If you're watching what you eat, you may pick up a can and look at the back, and you want to look at the ingredients, right? And you want to look at what the first ingredient is, and you want to look at the percentages. And I think that there's going to be an expectation as the consumer of AI becomes more sophisticated to be able to have access to that type of transparency with the AI that impacts their life and their business. So I'm curious if people want to chime in, if your organization is already in some type of discussion around AI ethics, because so far we found out that that's about 85%. So I'm really curious, based on the audience that we have today, if this is a topic of conversation within your organization. So what are some strategies? You know, one of the things that I talked about in the beginning that organizations around the world that we've spoken to really struggle with is how do you get off the starting block? How do you integrate AI into what you're doing? And I have some insights on this because we've talked to a lot of folks who've had some success, who had early success, some folks that have failed serially and seriously. And you know, there's a difference between experience and qualified experience. So one of the things when you're integrating AI is being introspective enough and being able to look at why you succeeded and why you failed. And that's one of the key points that we want to drive home as we go through this. So here's kind of the flyover. You know, here's 5 things that we've seen from organizations that have been very successful with integrating AI. And we're gonna break each of these 5 things down over the next few screens before we wrap up. And hopefully there'll be some practical things in here that you guys can take back to your respective workplaces. So start with pilot projects. I think organizations who haven't done a lot of pilots in the past, who maybe haven't been driven by innovation, can get really stuck with the whole concept of what a pilot is. With tools out there and resources like GitHub, I know there are people on this call who worked extensively with GitHub. There's all kinds of Jupyter notebooks. There's open data sets out there with Kaggle. So there's all types of opportunities to look at some well-trod paths of what other people have done and to use that as a starting point that you can pivot from and elaborate and kind of build your own pilots on. So you don't have to go out and build something that's absolutely just high impact. It's going to change the face of your business. Start small. Start small. Get some success. Begin to understand who in your organization are going to be the go-to resources. Where are the gaps? And we'll talk about upskilling here in a few slides. But get cross-functional teams in. When I talk to companies about AI, they're always really focused on the technology. And I try to explain to them that high impact AI lives at the intersection of deep subject matter expertise and just good technical hygiene, right? You need people who really have good intuition around how your business works, what makes it successful, and where it struggles. So when you're even at the early days, when you're rolling out some of your first pilots, you need the business represented, not just the technology. So make sure that you have your cross-functional people involved, even if you're doing something quite small. Because what we've seen, these cross-functional people who may not have the technical background, they're not Python programmers, they're not data scientists, they come in and they start asking some really good questions from the very beginning. And then when they get engaged, that's when we really see the needle move and progress start to happen. So align it with business goals. One of my key activities is working with early tenure consultants at Fortune 500 companies. I'm working with NCR, for example, on their first year and second year consultants. And when we talk about techniques for presenting emerging technology to leadership, we always say you can't come in all excited and talk about, AR, VR, or talk about, AI, unless you're aligning it with business goals. And we try to get them to do that in a very simple way. This is something that can increase revenue. This is something that can reduce cost. This is something that can improve customer experience, or this is something that can further differentiate us from our key competitor, right? So it's about getting that mentality. And this is, one of the best salespeople people I ever worked with. His little saying was, "It's the sell within the company that's more important than selling outside of the company." And if you want to sell your ideas and concepts within the organization, the way that you sell that is you align your initiative with business goals. And your business goals may be more complex than some of the ones that I just offered, but I think that that's just something smart to do as you're communicating your success upward within the organization. Upskill your workforce. This is so important. I do this every day. I'm in AI at some level every day. I'm building something, working with a team that's building a technology, getting requirements from an organization who's building AI, and we take it for granted that we're immersed in this. We listen to the YouTube videos, we know where to go get our resources, we're constantly updating ourselves. But what we found within these organizations, people are already working 60, 70 hours a week. They're overwhelmed, and they need intentional upskilling in order to move the needle within their organization. And the one thing that I would go back and focus on again, it's not just on your technical folks. You're very creative people. You have people who have deep subject matter expertise within their business line, across business lines. Those are going to be your heroes in this space. And part of equipping them is helping them to understand what's possible. What's the art of what's possible, and start having those conversations and then start turning them loose. But throughout this whole process, I would strongly recommend creating that partnership between your technical people and your lines of business. Get them talking to each other early, get them aligned, and you'd be surprised. It's not just helping to enable your creative people and your business people, but it's also helping your technical people. They start to learn how to better engage with the business, and they kind of step outside of their comfort zone of working with some of the more technical aspects of implementation to understand the business impact of AI. So developing an AI infrastructure, this is something that's probably a little bit more technical than we're going to jump into today. But the one key point I would make here is understanding your data, right? If you're already a data-driven organization, if you're integrating your data successfully, both your structured and non-structured data, that's your beginning, right? Because you can't get the deep digital insights that are possible from AI until you can truly access all of your data. So as a starting point, that would be where I would recommend that you start at is integrating all of your data from your different data sources to just give you the fuel that you need to start using AI in a way that can demonstrate major impact within your organization. And lastly, is foster a culture of innovation. One of my favorite sayings is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And a lot of the organizations that we've talked to, the tombstone has already been written for their initiative. We do this thing called the tombstone exercise, and we'll say, what will the tombstone of this project say if it's successful? And sometimes it's like, this group got out of the way, or my boss gave me enough time to do this, or whatever. And then we said, well, what will the tombstone of this project say if it's not successful? They're going to say, oh, just another shiny technology. My boss went to a conference and saw this and came back. It was another failure. It was a total waste of time. So moving away from that transactional type of approach and really understand to have a foster to foster that culture of innovation, having that entrepreneurship within the organization, and being able to award and recognize people who are moving the needle, having competitions, having hackathons, doing things that you would normally think you would see in a startup environment, where we're seeing a lot of this innovation happening. How can you capture some of that magic and energy that you have in startups around innovation within your organization to help foster this culture of innovation, particularly for AI? So what are some of the big challenges that we're seeing out there for these business leaders? Ethical and responsibility is this really gets people bogged down. You got to get the right people at the table. You got to try to make it as black and white and as comprehensive as possible from the beginning. Doing this wrong, it could be really bad. And it could, reputational damage could be, your brand could be damaged. There could be legal implications. So spending the time up front and getting the right people at the table to have those conversations is paramount. Integration and scalability. Once you've run your pilots, how do you start integrating this in across your business processes? Who oversees that? How do you scale this to the next level? These are challenges because it's not just an IT issue, right? It is a hybrid between, your business acumen and your business processes and technology. So I think there has to be an organizational shift on how we address this. And organizations are going to look differently. We're already seeing it happening, and people are trying to use the same titles in the same groups because we just don't want to let go of them. But we're going to have to change the way that we look at our structures and our governance inside organizations before I think we can have integration and scalability with AI the way that we have with some of the legacy technologies that have come through. And the last one is the talent and skills gap. And when in talking, especially in government, getting the talent that's needed is really tough because these jobs tend to pay pretty well. If you're an AI engineer, for even more technical than that, you can get compensated quite nicely. So how do you go out and I heard something like there's one qualified AI person for every 130 jobs open right now. So there's not a lot of talent. Now I don't know how true that is. That feels about right from what I've seen. But how do you go out and address that talent and skills gap? And so organizations have decided, I would say about 60% to build versus buy, and to take existing people who again have that deep business acumen and understanding and start building some of those AI capabilities, and then drawing a dash line and saying everything underneath this we're going to outsource. We're going to have a partner that we can work with this part. We're going to focus on these key areas that requires our deep subject matter expertise up front, and then we're going to find the tools and the vendors to help us get the last mile of our solution. Okay, so that's it for this part of the presentation. Hopefully that laid a little bit of some groundwork to have some interesting discussions moving forward, and interesting in everyone's thoughts and questions and interactions as we move forward.
Thank you, Brian. That was brilliant. Certainly, I've got a number of questions that I'm looking to ask, and we've already got some questions in the chat, so I'll kick off with that one. So, Melissa has kind of said, "Thanks, Brian. That's been so interesting. Would your recommended strategies change if you have all of your IT outsourced with solely a strategic lead in the organization? So, for example, like a CTO or something."
Yeah, I think that's really kind of that last model, isn't it? Is you have the IT part outsourced and you're really focused on the business impact, the problems that you're solving internally. So I don't think that would change. I don't think that would have to change your strategy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Obviously, the floor is now open to any of our panel members for you to ask questions. So do feel free to pop those into the chat box. But like I said, I certainly have a number of questions myself that I'm looking to get answers to. So I'll kind of I'll kick off with excuse me, get my words out there, with one of my own for the time being. So obviously, the pandemic, the blessing and the curse, as I like to call it, caused a number of organizations to kind of go through a digital transformation process, and many of those are just kind of coming to the end of that. And now AI is becoming, something that they should consider. Do organizations now need to go through that process again in order to identify what AI they should be incorporating, or do you think that will have come out as part of that process already?
Oh, maybe I can chip in on that one. I think the answer is yes, you have to start again, but it really depends on what you're looking to do, because the thing about the big difference between traditional digital transformation operations was that they were heavily focused on introducing the technology, not on what the outcomes were. That's why 80% of digital transformation fails. Now, we don't want that to happen with AI. We need to learn that lesson. So I would cut down the options into two categories. Either you're looking to automate, to pick up Brian's point, or you're looking to do something that you couldn't possibly do before because you can, well, it's also a large part of optimization, but are you looking for a completely innovative thing, or are you just looking to do what you do already much faster? But understand what those processes are if you are going to do that, because most people rushed into digital transformation without understanding what their processes were and how to automate them. So that's my answer.
Thanks. Anybody else, anything to add to that?
It's sort of on a related issue. I just wanted to go back to Brian's comment on the slide that talked about align with business goals, right? Which really came from more of a how do we pitch internally to have innovation. And I'm in a small company. Most of my career has been small companies, sometimes big companies. And I think from a small company perspective, right? Like, what does that have to do with me? And I think you want to go backwards, right? You want to think about, what do I want in my organization to be better, stronger, faster? If I had 50 interns, what would they be doing for me? What are the blockers? What are the repeated patterns? Blockers, a term we use in software a lot, right? What are the repeated problems that we're seeing over and over? And those are the things we can use AI to get out in front of, and we can really help small companies more than ever. So you don't need a giant team of developers. You don't have to understand what GitHub is or how to work a Jupyter notebook. Like, as someone said in the question earlier, there's a lot of outsourcing of tools, but you want to start thinking about, how could my business be better? What are the same problems I'm seeing over and over, and how can I get in front of that problem?
Yeah. So that actually leads quite nicely then to one of the questions that have come up in the chat. So it essentially says, Kevin here's asking, where on earth do small companies start? I mean, small as in there are two of us. So where do we even, where do we begin?
Yeah, I work a lot with small companies, and typically I do push people toward, because if you have two people, there's typically a technical person. If there's not a technical person in there, find someone to bring within your sphere of influence, inside your TP, so to speak, who can help you navigate that. But there's so many great projects. And again, Kaggle is such a fan. Kaggle is not just data sources, but there's actually code that you can use. There's notebooks out there. People are very willing to share. I have found there's a culture of sharing in AI that I haven't seen in previous iterations of technology. People willing to, and I don't know whether it's showing off or just a real desire to share, but I would definitely start off with samples that are already out there and built to get an idea of what this thing is, how it works, and you need data, right? You need some data to fuel this. So being able to step back, look at a lighthouse out there that's something similar, something maybe that's aspirational that you want to do, understanding how that's done, and then iterating and elaborating around that to start building the skills and understanding what resources you may need access to implement that AI. It takes some time. You have to do the hard yards to get there. You can't right click and create it. But I think that exploratory exercise of both the resources, the technical resources, the digital resources, and then the human resources that are out there that can help you, I think that's the place to start.
Excellent. Thank you.
Nicola,
Can I just-
sorry, Richard.
I was just going to say, however, do not underestimate the difficulty. The hard yards, as Brian just said, is if you have, for example, if you've not done any technology for, say, 10 years, or you are just coming into it from outside, you are in for a hard time. The language is completely different. The technology is completely different. Yes, there is an insane amount of material shared, but there are literally tens of thousands of libraries out there that all depend on each other. And frankly, there's probably people listening to this going, what's Kaggle? What's a Jupyter notebook? I mean, there is just so much to learn here.
Yeah.
That is so different to the way we built stuff in the past that you mustn't underestimate the effort. And equally, you mustn't get discouraged. And the idea of having somebody to help you through that maze is frankly the only way you're going to make it.
Alex, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, I was going to say that we're a small company, but our customers tend to be very large, and we've always had to box smart, but our goal 18 months ago was to understand how AI could do two things for us, and we had to be really focused because AI can do anything you want it to do, right? And you end up trying to boil the ocean. So our two things were, how do we make the online education that we're building for universities and global companies worldwide more personalized, which is an Achilles heel for online education, and also how do we make it evergreen? And that's what we focused on. Nothing else. The rest were nice to haves, but unless you take that a very strategic priority approach, then you will start boiling oceans. And you need to, as Richard said, you need to understand your own business, and you need to understand your customers, and you need to understand your own data, and make sure your data is as clean as possible it can be.
I think for those of you who are not in the chat, Kevin's come back to say, I love the idea of having interns, to which I have to read out Rose's comment of AI equals army of interns, because I love that comment. So I think that's brilliant. I think Kevin's quite happy with that answer. So another one of the questions that we've got here.
Sorry, Nicola, can I interrupt there? One of the downsides is that interns need supervision.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like outsourcing. People think they can outsource a project and that's it, it's going to get done. Wrong. You need to manage it. Having an army of 1,000 interns working for you means that you have to manage 1,000 people. And AI is like an intern. In fact, for example, code generation, it's like an enthusiastic recent graduate who is playing around with things and wanting to show off and gets it wrong. And you have to go and tell them how to fix it. It's not a straightforward thing. So just because you've got an army of interns doesn't mean to say that it's going to solve your problems. And they can't make coffee.
Yet, maybe. So Kevin agrees. He's come back and said it's all about finding that balance. So one of the other questions then that we have here in the chat is, what are your thoughts on small language models versus large language models?
All right, I'll chip in first. Small language models of the future. Large language models are an interesting diversion that got us to where we are today and will continue to have some general applicability, but small language models are what we're going to see in the vast majority of industrial deployments.
Okay, you want to give a definition of both, please?
Okay, a large language model is one that is built on a very general set of data that is claiming to know everything there is to know about everything. Whereas a small language model is one that is built on your dedicated set of data or a dedicated set of data. So picking up Alex's example, it's based on a set of course definitions, or in pharma, it might be based on a set of patient results, or in logistics, it's knowing where the storms happen in the Caribbean. The smallness means that it can answer more accurately, and it takes an awful lot less energy to make it work.
I think there's an agreement there with your comment, Richard. It says,
Yeah, and
small language models rule.
Yeah, and Brian and myself and Rose have been working on some projects where the outcome has been building a small language model, because that is the best solution for a corporate. Yeah, Brian, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think it's like Richard was saying, it's a big distraction. People start reading all this about this version of this llama, this came out, that came out. It's incredibly time expensive, it's compute expensive, it requires a lot of expertise, the connectors are expensive, and people just went out kind of willy-nilly and started building their own. But again, going back to kind of my core theme is high impact AI lives at the intersection of deep subject matter expertise and good technical hygiene. So you can get that deep subject matter expertise with that small language model that you're not going to get in this black box of a large language model.
And can't we just rent them, Brian and Richard? Can't we just rent the large language model? Why would we build our own?
Absolutely. So I think the future is very much a combination of use a large language model that someone else built for the bits that need it, but you build your own one. And so, for example, diving into, say, legal activities, the last thing you want to do is start putting all your confidential data up into somebody else's model. But if you want to interpret the question or vectorize some chunk of text, then you don't want to be building that yourself. So absolutely.
Excellent. So another question that we've got in the chat here is, are there any tips on spotting the emergence of bias?
Okay, I'll chip in again here. I think that there's a very interesting thing that, and since Kenny unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, I was going to chip in what he would say is that bias and ethics don't matter. And I was going like, what do you mean? And then the answer to it is actually what actually matters is risk. So if you're a business, you are in risk of litigation, you are at risk of reputational damage, as Brian mentioned, etc. There are lots of risks there. So one of the ways of thinking about bias is that, are you introducing a risk that if a human was doing it, they'd be up in front of HR? So I'm not going to say this is easy, but constantly monitoring the output of something is really, really important. And it really depends on what sort of service you're offering to see how it emerges. Because if you're looking at data, you end up with a very interesting set of things around actual data, because there are certain activities out there, like us Scots have a natural tendency to have higher blood pressure. Now, if the AI comes back and says you've got high cholesterol, high blood pressure, that could be considered, because you're Scottish, it could be considered bias. But it's actually factual data. So it's very important to have a definition of bias and then monitor it continuously.
And I think that can go both ways, right, Richard? Just because it's factual doesn't mean it's not biased, right? Because like if 90% of engineers are men, that doesn't mean that men make better engineers, right? So
Correct.
Correlation is not causation. So I think it's almost impossible to find the emergence of bias. I think you see it after it happens and then you course correct.
Okay. That makes sense.
And,
it was
and
a
that's
very,
why, and that's why we have a lawyer on this panel. That was great.
yeah. And
It's
I
actually a
thought it
really
was a
easy
really
time.
good.
Sorry,
I
it's a
thought-
really easy time to be a lawyer in this space because the answer to everything is it depends. And I'll get back to you because we're really seeing so much change so quickly that in the US as well as over there, the case law first develops and then we know what works and what doesn't, right? And the regulation is coming out so slowly. Although, a lot of UK was first in GDPR, and I think that really helped us get ready to think about how are we using data, what's appropriate, how do we take out the personalization of the data. So, everything's a process. But I think that means look to your, and I'm off on a tangent a little bit, but I think it means look to your own ethics for, does that feel right? If that happened to me and my data, do I feel upset by that? And go with more of a personal sort of litmus test of, does that seem uncool to behave in that way?
Ask your lawyers.
Well, and have people in the room, right? Like to Brian's point earlier,
Yeah.
you want your creative people, your business people, and your lawyers in the room when you're unpacking these issues, and they can all hear early on. When I work with a television production company, for example, on my media side, I'm really early in the process. So they're going to be like, okay, so we're going to take this helicopter and the coolest shot will be this. I was like, you can't do any of that. You're going to have to rethink that. And so the earlier I can be in the process with your tech person and with your lawyer and with your business people, they can say, your CTO could say, like, that's not how any of this works. We don't know where that data came from. We don't have it parsed like that. So getting everybody in the room will really help from an early stage.
Can I just say something, Nicola? It was a great impersonation of Kenny Fraser. If those of you who don't know Kenny Fraser, apart from the doer and the end of the world is nigh, and Richard is just qualified as an expert witness in AI to give his opinions in big court cases. So it's not just one lawyer on the panel. That's why it's taken so long. That's it, Nick.
No bother.
Clarification, I am not a lawyer, but I am an expert witness, and I do work in large tech cases, and I work extensively with law. One of the things that's really interesting at the moment is that there's actually a program run by the World Economic Forum for chief legal officers for the top 200 companies. And those chief legal officers are looking at how to build a list of the most difficult problems they're facing. And AI is definitely one of them, and ethics in there. So that's actually going to be really interesting.
Yeah. So one of the words that were kind of mentioned at the beginning of this session was fear, kind of fear around AI. So, if you are a business leader and you've taken the decision to, you're going to start deploying AI, you're going to utilize it within your business, but your staff are kind of nervous about the deployment of that, how would you reassure them that it's the correct decision that you've made and, it's the right thing to do?
Can I kick off on that? It's happening, whether you like it or not. Your staff are using AI all over the place. There's a huge democratization going on. It's out of control, and people don't realize that AI fundamentals is really important in how you set things up.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that we've never seen anything like this before, right? People are using every different type of AI out there in the marketplace while they're working, and you as an organization have very little control over that. So one of the key things is, and I don't think people fear it, because most people who are, I've interviewed about 100 chief AI officers globally now for a particular research project. And it started off with FO, fear of. Then it started fear of missing out, FOMO, and now it's gone to foggy, fear of getting involved, right? And every organization seems to be the same. Huge amount of hand-holding required, to kick things off. And I suppose the fear is that everybody's doing their own thing at the moment, and unless you get some structure in, all that information is out there in the marketplace, is in the world now. If I want to go and see somebody's secure business strategy for the way forward, somebody's probably used the OpenAI in their own fear, and now it's sitting there. So there's that aspect that is really happening as we speak that has to be controlled. Sorry, I went off on a rant. I thought it was Kenny Fraser.
Well, I do think there needs to be a wee bit of intent and structure, because I agree that people are using it. I know one of the traditional big four firms, there's a group that gets together every Thursday afternoon. Martha plugs her laptop into the projector. They sit around a table because she's good with ChatGPT, and they put things in and try to solve problems. And actually, some of those sessions are productive, but imagine how much more productive that they could be with more intent and structure and purpose about. Because now it's like they know they can do great things just with ChatGPT, and they've solved problems, and they've been able to learn a lot, but they're not really moving forward, and it's not, and they're not democratizing out of that business line across the organization. So I think having just a bit more focus and intent, and being driven by making incremental improvements, again, democratizing this out to your staff. And back to the original question, I do think there needs to be a bit of table setting with that staff and get some common terms and definitions. Because one of the first things any new culture does is it builds a language. The language around AI is incredibly complex. In fact, a lot of what we're calling AI, some people just see like Facebook. If you guys remember this, when your parents got it, you ask them if they had email, like, oh, I've got Facebook. Remember, they thought that Facebook was email, and some, I think Alex still does actually, but but to be able to get beyond the complexities of the language, and get that culture set of what this is and what the capabilities are, and here's some examples of how that can be used. I like the idea, even with ChatGPT, of prompt libraries, getting people to share some prompts. I write prompts every day. I write prompts differently than anyone I've seen. Some of my prompts are a page and a half, and I keep them and save them. But I'm doing very specific things that I've learned through an empirical process of trial and failure, trial and failure, trial and failure to build that. And I've seen people go in to use ChatGPT. They've used it twice. They didn't get what they wanted. They're like, it doesn't work. So there's a mentality that we have to have. Even the people that are really good with AI will tell you they fail 90% of the time, maybe more, before they get to what they want. And that's different. Yeah, that's a culturally different approach to solving problems.
There's actually a very strong correspondence with people using search, because some people just can't find stuff, and you just need to know how to search. And writing prompts is difficult, as you were just saying. It's far more complicated than writing a search query. And one of the reasons it's more complicated is you get this long, friendly, kind of engaging response back, rather than not getting what you wanted. And I think that probably takes people down the wrong path. So yes, it's an emerging user experience.
Definitely. That's
But
great.
circling back to fear, I think what a lot of people are afraid of is losing their job, right? Like, how does this affect me personally and my wallet? And I think, we've experienced in our lifetime a lot of automation, right? Like, there are kiosks now where there used to be grocery clerks. And is that terrible? No, that was kind of a tedious job. So I think tedious jobs can be solved by computers. We already know that. And I don't think that's a terrible thing. I think we really need to emphasize that information is more of a commodity than ever, but we still need to focus on wisdom, right? Like, you bring something special to your job. As a leader, I would reassure the staff, you bring something special that cannot be replaced by a computer at this point. Maybe someday, but right now, you have emotional intelligence, you understand how the business works differently. You're not just about information, you have wisdom to bring to the table. And I think really empowering people with boots on the ground, that you have knowledge of the company and our business that is special and unique. So you're not getting replaced by a computer yet. and probably not. It's not Terminator. That's not how any of this stuff works. And to really, as Brian referred to, like, make a lexicon of common languages, and let's have a culture of innovation. And in a culture of innovation, we have to value failure. We are going to need to find balance, and we find that balance through failure. When you see a little infant starting to walk, you don't scold it when it falls over, and you don't think, ugh, well, that baby is never going to walk. It's just that baby doesn't have it. You realize that it falls. Eventually it finds balance, and then it learns to climb and falls, right? So we're going to do the same thing in the organization. As we learn to use AI, we are going to fail, and eventually we'll have breakthroughs, and you're not getting fired.
Yeah, I think all good comments there, Rose. Thank you. Anything else to add to that, or I've got another couple of questions that I'd like to ask. So I think just kind of following on from that, if you've made the decision now, you're going to deploy AI within your business, there are a huge number of suppliers or organizations who claim to be suppliers of AI. How do you make the decision? How do you pick the one that's right for your organization?
Well, I can chip in again. I think it goes back to Brian's point around that you have to have deep industry knowledge, not AI industry knowledge. So I'll give an example of the company that I worked with for a bit called Jasper, which is about marketing. It's a generative AI package for marketing that has workflows built into it. It understands different marketing styles. So it knows how to write in the style of an Etsy post versus an Amazon post versus something in the Financial Times. And it has publishing processes for review and everything else built into it. So they have taken a lot of expert knowledge in the domain of marketing and digital marketing, obviously, and embedded it in the middle of the generative AI. So that's an example. Then there are other specialist tools out there. We've talked about medical ones, and there's all sorts of interesting areas. There's lots of legal tools out there of dubious validity. So even the legal reference of all the biggest one is LexisNexis. It is constantly being challenged about the quality. But there's a famous incident which my lawyer friends refer to as a Motta moment, where the attorney famously wrote a brief using ChatGPT that cheerfully went along and invented lots of case law to support his case. Unfortunately, it didn't exist. Now, that is an example of how not to pick something. So if you do go to LexisNexis, it will come up with all the case law that it thinks is relevant. Well, doesn't always get it right, but I hope there's nobody from LexisNexis on here listening to this. But one of the biggest problems with AI, and this is an interesting one generally, is that most of the generative AI systems do not understand time, whereas the law is extremely time sensitive. So you may have come up with a decision that 20 years ago, 10 years on, that it's changed, 5 years on again, it's changed again. But the AI doesn't really understand that these have replaced the previous ones. So what you really need to have is a provider that is steeped in your industry. And it doesn't matter whether you're making artisan churned butter or whether you're a lawyer. You need to know that you're working with somebody who understands what you do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more violently. That is so important. And the other thing to add on to that is find a vendor who does exactly what you're looking for. Because I've got a story where someone was looking for a vendor to do a very specific type of news harvesting, and they found somebody who was collecting financial information to do Dun and Bradstreet type thing. So, it's similar. It's the similar type of harvesting. But the gap in subject matter expertise and context was so huge, it wound up being a tremendous failure. So find someone who has the subject matter expertise, who knows your business, who does exactly what you're looking for, and spend the time to do that, because the retrofitting in this just doesn't seem to work very well.
Excellent, thank you. So we will be moving just shortly to Richard's kind of closing remarks. So if anybody has any other questions they'd like to put into the chat, then I'd ask that you kind of do that now. I still have another couple of questions. I have lots of questions actually though, but I don't want to monopolize all of the time, but I am going to ask another one. So artificial intelligence is obviously, AI is one of the words that have been around as one of those kind of hot topics for the last 12 months. But another word is obviously sustainability. That's another one that we hear a lot of over the last 12 months. So how can we as organizations ensure that our AI deployment and kind of sustainability actions are aligned, or can we? Is there a mismatch there? Stumped you.
I was waiting for Alex. That's his area, so I didn't want to step on his toes.
Yeah, sure. You know, if you go and apply or give us your email, we'll start the process with a digital sustainability course that you can go through. You know, AI is hugely energy sapping, right? As our data centers, as our, you know, we just finished building a crypto course, and you know, to develop a coin will take probably the energy of a small West African nation. So we really got to be conscious of that. I mean, part of our own conscious is that we build the climate education products free, because nobody and give them away, because we want that awareness, knowing that we're building stuff on AI and so on the other side to compensate. I think Kenny would be the best person to answer this question. As time evolves, we will become much more better at using energy to develop AI solutions. The big boys are building, you know, solar countries at the moment, and even some of them are talking about reopening nuclear plants because they need that energy to drive it. I think, like all these things, there's a balance that you can't just stop, right? You just got to be aware of all the other things you can do to compensate it. Now, that was a bit of waffle. Sorry about that. But if you do the course and give us feedback, then we can make the course better.
Can I chip in with a slightly different answer, which is nothing that Alex has said is wrong. However, living with it is not necessarily the right thing. To go back to the question earlier about SLMs, so small language models for language processing. Remember, not everything is language processing. The other thing that's really interesting is edge AI, and there's a lot of interesting happening around edge AI. So what's edge AI? It's stuff that sits at the perimeter of your network. It's not heavily energy consumptive. It typically sits in switches and routers that are sitting on the edge of it, or routers for the British audience. And people like Cisco are looking at building that into it. And I think there's actually a really interesting future where you could imagine pushing edge AI into the sort of street boxes that are at the bottom of cell towers. Now, this becomes really interesting when you move into, for example, African nations, where building data centers is not easy to do, and people don't necessarily have local compute. But if you can have very lightweight models that run on lightweight hardware that's already there, then that's a transformative distributed network. And I think that's where we're going to end up with getting away with this obsession with building the biggest possible data center with more NVIDIA chips in it than anybody else. You know, that's, I'm afraid, is a rather American obsession. You know, it's like the 8-liter pickup truck to drive one box of fruit to the market. I prefer the European approach of having one of these tiny little Vespa vehicles with the box of fruit in the back. So I do think that we are going to see ways to reduce the energy consumption.
Excellent. So there are no other questions in the chat just now, although I am very confident that we have only scratched the surface of this conversation for today. In the interest of time, we're going to move to Richard, who's going to kind of sum things up for us and kind of wrap up the session for us. But more than happy to make introductions to any of the panelists on the call today for anybody who has joined us. As I certainly know myself, sometimes it's difficult to think of questions when you've just received so much information, but they certainly come flooding in once you've had had a chance to digest it all. So more than happy to make those introductions. So Richard, pass over to you for some closing remarks.
Unmuting, there we go. Hopefully.
Is it even a Teams call if it doesn't happen once?
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully you can now see 5 key points. So I built my first AI system back in 1981 when I was a student doing AI at Edinburgh University as one of the topics. And things have changed a lot, but one of the things I think is really important is that it's a classic example of it takes 20 years to become an overnight success. I think it's well worth bearing that in mind as we think about AI. So the last 18 months has seen millions and millions of dollars poured into PR, even almost as much as being poured into buying NVIDIA chips, but there's a huge amount of PR out there, whereas this has actually been going for a long time. So if this PowerPoint would show me it. So I've got 5 key takeaways that I wanted to talk about, which is, as we've said, think about the use case first. What are you wanting to build? Don't start with we need to use AI. That's just the wrong starting place for any kind of technology discussion, but think about it as coming in with, what do you want to achieve? And as I said earlier, is this something we want to reduce costs, or do we want to do something we've never been able to do before? One of the things about the army of interns is that you can think about it as an army of, not necessarily interns, but an army of people who can do simple tasks for you. So an interesting example is call center monitoring of conversations to see what is happening across all your different agents. No human can listen to every single call or review every single chat log from a contact center, but an AI can. The AI can read 10,000, 100,000, a million calls a day, however big your contact center is, and it can start spotting things that are common across it. It can also spot angry customers. Is there a big failure out there that you might not otherwise be able to pick up? May also be able to pick up agents who are not performing in the way that you want to, switching to brand things. So that's something that you physically couldn't do before because it was just too expensive to have people who would review all of those. But the AI lets you do that. And it's really interesting looking for these new innovative areas where you simply couldn't do it before, either because of technology or because of cost. It's also important to remember that there's a lot more to AI than generative AI. I mean, there's machine learning type predictive, there was expert systems, which are still out there. Expert systems have been around since the 1980s. There's been a lot of very interesting developments around this. There's also a lot of the agentic. There's more and more stuff coming out there. Lots of different architectures that you can see sitting around AI that make it more interesting. So the most powerful approach seems to be actually combining these together, so that, as we talked about earlier, you don't want to build your own large language model. So what you can do is you can take that large language model and marry it up to something else like predictive or some of the other different technologies that are out there. I'm not going to try and talk about all of them because A, we don't have time, and B, it gets kind of complicated. Then, as I've mentioned, bigger is not necessarily better, which links into that. And I've seen comments that people are holding back from buying things like Salesforce CRM systems because they have been told that they can just wait for AGI and OpenAI and ChatGPT will replace all of your SaaS software. No, it won't. That's just silly. So this is definitely something where you need to identify those outcomes and go for it with the most appropriate technology. Doesn't make it better, bigger doesn't make it better. And if you're waiting for AGI, you're going to be waiting for a very long time. AGI being artificial general intelligence, which people can't even define what it means. We are so far away from that. It's really, really important to not wait for it. And apart from anything else, that what is AGI? What is understanding? We don't even know how the human brains work, let alone some of the neural network technologies which work despite us not really understanding them. Now, this got mentioned a couple of times. Data quality and process quality are super important for success. Data quality is really important. If you train a model of any kind with bad data, you're going to end up with bad results. And most organizations have problems with data quality. Now, we're not talking about databases here. We're not looking at numerical information. We're typically looking at sort of a SharePoint or a Dropbox or something. It's full of documents, and many of those documents are duplicates, many are out of date. So you really have to go through and clean that data before you start attempting to use that to build models. And that's a huge effort. There's a few interesting companies out there working on it. So I would suggest somebody like Shelf, for example, is really interesting, where they have what I like to think of as a continuous cleaning process, like a washing machine for your data, that is looking at the quality and extracting the information from it. But it's also true about process quality. It's very important to not try and implement an AI-based process that you don't understand yourself. And this is a classic thing that you see all the time in ERP deployments. People building an ERP system do not understand how their business works. And therefore, they take the ERP and it all falls apart horribly and ends up in legal issues and people like me trying to figure out what went wrong. What went wrong is almost certainly that the people building it did not understand the process that they were trying to implement. Therefore, if you automate something that you don't understand, you just end up with an automation that doesn't work. So these two things are far more important than the back-end AI technology, because that stuff will not work unless you get these fundamentals right. And then finally, of the 5 key points, compliance is a very interesting topic that is starting to emerge. Compliance includes the ethics and risks, includes bias detection, all the rest of it, but it also impacts things like ISO 27001 or ISO 9000 certifications, because these standards are not designed for AI. ISO 27001, interestingly, has really only just managed to grasp cloud support. And we're now looking at a whole bunch of other things that were not necessarily covered in there and weren't considered when they're writing it. So I think it's a really important area for people to look at compliance. If you're a compliance business, if you're ISO certified, you really need to be thinking about what is the impact of AI on that. So that's my 5 key points that I think that be good for you to take away. Now, as a little taster of what's going to be happening with Tech Trends presentation. First of all, what is Tech Trends? Every January, we do a bit of a world tour, including Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Aberdeen. Is there anywhere else in the world? Where we present, where I present 10 typically tech trends that I think are going to be important for the following year. And I also usually spend some time dissing things like crypto or the metaverse. But I will also, at the end of every session, go through and review how I got on with last year's one. So I go back and look at my 10 previous ones and see whether those predictions are correct. You also get to have pizza and free beer. Is it free? I don't know. You get it with it. It's free for me anyway. And one of the things I'm going to pull out of that presentation, not as a spoiler, but because it's linked to this, is one of the things that I've talked about several occasions in these sessions is tech inequality. And tech inequality is a massive problem, both for individuals and for businesses. So there are businesses out there that already have 20 successful AI deployments, and there's other people who don't even have secure cybersecurity in place in their businesses, and they are in severe risk of being hacked. And that's the level. So there's people who are still using Windows 95 out there, believe it or not, and the AI just pushes that inequality even greater. And it does apply to individuals as well, that this is a massive difference between those who are in economic poverty and educational poverty are not given access to this. So that's one of my topics from for January. I'll leave it to Kat to say the dates because I can't remember them off the top of my head. I'm not very good at remembering where I have to be. That's what I have computers for. They come up and tell me. So those are my 5 takeaways. And yes, I will be expanding on other things besides AI and tech trends.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Richard. So Tech Trends take place on the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday of the week of the 20th of January. And they are free for Scotland is members to attend, but there is a cost for non-members not to attend. So if that doesn't encourage you to take up Scotland is membership, then I don't know what will. I want to say a huge, huge thank you to Brian, Richard, Rose and Alex for joining us for today's session. Like I said before, more than happy to make introductions questions to anybody who has joined us on the call today, and thank you very much for taking the time to do so. One final reminder that everybody who has joined us today will get free access to the digital sustainability course, thanks to Jump Digital for providing that to us. So we will follow up with the information on that. Lots of comments coming through here on the chat, guys, just to say thank you. Great session, really enjoyed it. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you everybody for joining us. I think we've finished just a little bit sharp. So in addition to all this wonderful information, we're also able to give you back the gift of 10 minutes, which if your diary is anything like mine, I'm sure you will all be very grateful for. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording and end the session there. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Thank you.